Have you ever noticed how some people start shaking the moment you stop talking? Not physically, but mentally. The moment you go quiet, they get uncomfortable. They rush to fill the space. They over-explain. They laugh too much. They try to prove something. And you didn't say a single word. That's the power of silence. But this isn't about being calm. This is about what your silence does to insecure people. Because silence is not empty. Silence is a mirror, and insecure people are terrified of mirrors. There was a man named Armand who learned this the hard way. Armand wasn't loud. He wasn't dominant. He wasn't the guy who controlled the room with jokes or big speeches. He was quiet, not weak quiet, observing quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you wonder what he's thinking. And that quietness made people uncomfortable long before he understood why. In school, when arguments broke out, everyone shouted. Armand didn't. He would just look, listen, tilt his head slightly, and say nothing. At first, people thought he had nothing to say. Then they started noticing something strange. The louder others became, the calmer he looked. The more someone tried to insult him, the less reaction they got. And something unsettling happened. The person insulting him started losing control. They would repeat themselves, raise their voice, add more words, more attacks. Because silence forces a person to sit with their own noise, and insecure people hate hearing themselves. Years later, Armand entered the corporate world, a place full of egos. Meetings were battles, ideas were weapons, voices competed like they were fighting for oxygen. One afternoon, a senior manager publicly criticized his proposal, not constructively, aggressively. "You clearly don't understand market dynamics," the manager snapped. The room went quiet. All eyes moved to Armand. This was the moment. Most people would defend themselves immediately, throw data, raise tone, protect ego. Armand didn't. He simply looked at the manager, calm, still, unblinking. 5 seconds passed. Then 10. The silence became heavy. The manager shifted in his seat, cleared his throat. "Unless you have something to say?" Armand leaned back slightly and said softly, "I'm listening." That was it. 3 words, but those 3 words felt like pressure, because now the manager had to continue, had to justify, had to explain, and the more he talked, the weaker his argument sounded. He began contradicting himself, over-explaining, fumbling. The room slowly turned, not because Armand attacked, but because he didn't. Silence doesn't expose confident people. It exposes fragile ones. Because confident people are comfortable with pauses. Insecure people need noise to survive. Noise distracts from doubt. Noise hides fear. Noise fills the gap where self-worth should be. But silence removes that shield. And when there's no shield, insecurity panics. You see, insecure people constantly measure themselves through reaction. If you argue back, they feel powerful. If you defend yourself, they feel superior. If you explain too much, they feel important. But when you stay silent, they don't know where they stand. And not knowing is terrifying to someone who survives on validation. Armand didn't always understand this. In fact, when he was younger, he thought something was wrong with him. People would say, "Why are you so quiet? Say something. Do you even care?" He cared deeply. He just didn't perform his emotions for approval, and that alone threatened people who depended on performance. One particular colleague, Raza, loud, charismatic, always talking about his achievements. But underneath that charm was something fragile. Raza needed applause. He needed agreement. He needed visible reactions. One day, during a presentation, Raza exaggerated his role in a successful project. Armand knew the truth. He had done most of the work. Everyone in the room glanced at Armand, waiting for him to correct the story. He didn't. He simply sat there, expression neutral, listening. and something strange happened. Raza kept talking and talking and talking, trying to convince everyone, but the longer Armand stayed silent, the more Raza's voice cracked. Because silence doesn't attack, it reveals. It forces a person to confront their own exaggeration, their own insecurity, their own need to be seen. After the meeting, someone approached Armand and said, "Why didn't you say anything? He stole your credit." Armand smiled slightly. He didn't steal anything. The results will speak. And they did. Weeks later, performance metrics were released. Numbers don't shout, they don't argue, they don't defend. They simply exist, and the truth became obvious. Raza's confidence slowly turned into defensiveness, because when someone insecure realizes they cannot control the narrative, panic begins. Silence is powerful because it creates psychological space, and insecure people cannot survive in empty space. They need constant reassurance that they matter, constant confirmation that they're winning, constant feedback that they are enough. When you remove your reaction, you remove their measurement, and without measurement, they feel invisible. And to someone insecure, invisibility feels like death. But here's where it gets deeper. Silence isn't just about others, it's about you. Most people talk too much because they're afraid of being misunderstood, afraid of being judged, afraid of losing control. But silence requires strength. It requires self-trust. It requires emotional control. You don't stay quiet because you have nothing to say. You stay quiet because you don't need to prove anything. And that level of self-assurance is rare. One evening, Armand faced his biggest test, a board meeting, high stakes, millions on the line. A competitor tried to undermine him publicly, questioning his competence. The attack was sharp, personal, calculated. All eyes turned to Armand again. The competitor smirked slightly, expecting defense. Instead, Armand folded his hands calmly and waited. The silence stretched longer than comfort allowed. People shifted in their chairs. The competitor spoke again, trying to fill the gap. Then again and again, each sentence weaker than the last. Because now, he wasn't arguing with Armand, he was arguing with the room, and the room was watching him unravel. Finally, Armand spoke, not loudly, not aggressively, just clearly. "I don't need to discredit you to prove my point." One sentence, calm, grounded, unshaken. And in that moment, the dynamic shifted permanently. Because power isn't in volume, it's in control. And insecure people lose control when they can't control you. But here's the twist most people don't realize. Silence only works when it's real. If you're silent but burning inside, if you're silent but desperate for approval, people feel that. True silence comes from inner security, and inner security is built in private battles no one sees. Armand wasn't born calm, he built it. Through rejection, through failure, through nights of self-doubt, through learning that not every attack deserves a response. Because reacting gives permission, and silence denies it. And when you deny insecure people the reaction they crave, they panic. Not because you hurt them, but because you removed their measurement of validation. And suddenly, they are left alone with themselves. And that is the loudest silence of all.
The truth is, silence is easy when nothing is at stake. It becomes dangerous when everything is. Because the real test of silence doesn't happen in meetings. It happens when someone you trusted tries to break you. And Armand was about to learn that. Raza didn't forget the humiliation of that boardroom moment. Insecure people don't process defeat. They personalize it. They replay it. They let it grow teeth. And slowly, quietly, Raza began planting seeds, small comments, subtle doubts. Armand doesn't communicate enough. He's hard to read. Can we really trust someone who never speaks up? Notice the pattern. When insecure people can't overpower you, they try to reframe you. Silence, which once looked like strength, was now being presented as weakness. And here's what most people don't understand. Silence protects you, but it also makes you a target. Because you don't defend yourself, and insecure people see that as opportunity. Whispers started circulating, not loud enough to confront, not direct enough to attack, but strategic. Armand felt it. The energy in rooms shifted. Conversations paused when he entered. Smiles became thinner. Something was changing. For the first time in years, doubt crept in. Should he speak more? Should he defend himself? Should he explain who he really is? This is where most strong people break. Not because of open attacks, but because of invisible pressure. You see, silence is powerful externally, but internally, it can be heavy. At night, Armand would replay conversations in his head. Maybe I should have said something. Maybe they misunderstood me. Maybe silence isn't strength. Maybe it's avoidance. That's how insecurity spreads. Not just in the loud ones, but in the quiet ones too. And here's the dangerous part. Insecure people don't just fear silence, they try to infect it. One evening, after weeks of tension, Armand was called into a private meeting. Raza sat across from him, calm, smiling, too calm. You know, Raza began softly, people feel disconnected from you. Armand listened. You're talented, no doubt, but leadership isn't just results, it's presence, communication, energy. Still silence. Raza leaned forward. Sometimes silence looks like arrogance. That word hung in the air, arrogance. It was designed to trigger, to provoke, to make him react. Because if Armand defended himself emotionally, Raza would win. But this wasn't a boardroom now. This was personal. And for a split second, Armand felt anger rise. Not loud anger, cold anger, the kind that tightens your chest. He wanted to say, you talk too much because you're insecure. He wanted to expose him, but instead he asked one simple question. Who told you that? Raza paused, just slightly. Enough. Several people, he replied vaguely. Silence again. Longer this time. And here's what silence does in private confrontation. It forces truth to breathe. Raza's ahs shifted, because the truth was, no one had directly said it. He had constructed the narrative. And now, under the weight of silence, it started cracking. In leadership, clarity matters. If there's feedback, I'll address it. But assumptions don't help anyone. No emotion, no attack, just grounded words. And that's when Raza realized something terrifying. Armand wasn't silent because he was weak. He was silent because he was aware. Aware of manipulation, aware of projection, aware that insecure people accuse others of what they fear being, arrogant, disconnected, invisible. The meeting ended without explosion, but the war didn't. Insecure people rarely stop when exposed, they escalate. Over the next month, pressure intensified. Projects were reassigned without explanation. Invitations excluded him. Credit became blurry. This wasn't about performance anymore. It was about control. And control is oxygen for insecure minds. One night, sitting alone in his apartment, Armand stared at his reflection in the dark window. For the first time, silence felt lonely. There's a cost to not defending yourself loudly. People don't always see your battles. They just see your calm face. And sometimes they assume you feel nothing. But he felt everything. The doubt, the isolation, the temptation to break character, to stand up in the next meeting and say everything, expose everything, clear his name. Because silence doesn't always feel like power. Sometimes it feels like suffocation. And here's the deeper truth. Silence only works when you're willing to lose. Lose approval, lose validation, lose the need to control perception. If you still crave being understood by everyone, silence will destroy you. Because people will misunderstand you, they will project onto you, they will rewrite you, and you won't correct them. That requires terrifying strength. Weeks later, the company faced a crisis. A major deal collapsed. Financial tension filled the air, and suddenly leadership had to choose who would handle recovery.
Performance history was reviewed, data analyzed, results examined. Not rumors, not whispers, numbers. And numbers don't care about narratives. In that critical moment, truth resurfaced. Armand's projects were the most stable, the most profitable, the most efficient. The board called him in. Not Raza, him. The same quiet man people questioned. He was offered temporary control over the crisis operation. And here's where the real test happened. Power was now in his hands. He could retaliate. He could expose Raza publicly. He could shift the narrative brutally. And insecure people expected that, because insecure people assume everyone thinks like them. But Armand didn't attack. He didn't mention past manipulation. He didn't seek revenge. He simply did the work. Focused, calm, precise. And something powerful happened. The louder personalities became quieter. The ones who thrived on drama became irrelevant, because in crisis, noise becomes liability, and silence becomes strategy. Within months, the company stabilized. Respect returned. But this time, it wasn't forced. It was earned quietly. Raza's energy changed. Not aggressive anymore. Not dominant. Just uncertain. Because the one thing insecure people fear most isn't being attacked. It's being irrelevant. And silence makes them irrelevant. One evening, as the office emptied, Armand approached Raza again. Different posture. Less ego. "You know," he admitted, "I misjudged you." Simple words, but heavy. Armand looked at him, and for the first time there was no tension, because silence had done its job, not by destroying someone, but by revealing them. And here's the realization most people miss. Silence doesn't make insecure people panic because it's mysterious. It makes them panic because it removes control. They can't predict you. They can't manipulate you. They can't measure themselves against your reaction. And when they can't measure, they feel lost. But the deeper twist, silence also reveals you. If you're secure, silence empowers you. If you're insecure, silence exposes you. That's why some people feel peaceful around quiet strength, and others feel threatened. Because silence is neutral. It simply amplifies what already exists inside. And Armand finally understood something that changed everything. He wasn't powerful because he was silent. He was powerful because he was not afraid of what silence would reveal, about others and about himself. And that is why insecure people panic, because when the noise fades, there is nowhere left to hide.
Silence is not born in boardrooms. It is born in moments when a child realizes that speaking does not make him safer. Armand was 9 years old the first time he understood this. His house was never truly quiet. Doors closed too hard. Voices rose too fast. Small mistakes turned into loud storms. His father believed volume was authority. His older brother believed dominance was survival. And Armand learned observation. One night at dinner, his brother accidentally spilled water. It was nothing, a glass tipping over. A napkin could fix it. But the reaction was not small. His father slammed his hand on the table. "Why are you always careless?" The room shrank. His brother tried to explain. "I didn't mean—" "Excuses," his father snapped. The more his brother spoke, the worse it became. Every word added fuel. Every defense sounded like disrespect. And Armand watched something carefully. The more you talk in front of an insecure authority, the more they feel challenged. An insecure authority doesn't want explanation. It wants submission. That night, Armand made a quiet decision. When tension rises, reduce words. When ego is loud, don't compete. When someone wants reaction, don't feed it. He didn't call it strategy, he called it survival. Years passed. School became easier because he knew how to read rooms. He could sense insecurity in teachers, in classmates, in friends. Some people needed attention, some needed praise, some needed to win. And the moment he stopped giving them reaction, their behavior changed. One classmate, Adil, loved embarrassing others. He would tease people publicly just to get laughs. One day he targeted Armand. "Why do you look so serious all the time? You think you're better than us?" The class laughed lightly. All eyes turned. Adil expected a comeback, or anger, or at least embarrassment. Armand simply looked at him, not angry, not smiling, just looking. 3 seconds, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. The laughter faded first. Then Adil shifted in his seat. "Whatever," he muttered, looking away. Because mockery needs participation, and silence removes the stage. But here's the part no one saw. After school, Armand would sit alone sometimes, not because he had no friends, but because silence had become his shield, and shields are heavy. There is a difference between choosing silence and hiding in it. For years, he wasn't sure which one he was doing. Was he strong or just afraid of conflict? That question followed him into adulthood. That question followed him into every boardroom. Because silence can look like power, but sometimes it is just pain that learned to stay quiet. The turning point didn't happen at work. It happened when his mother fell ill. Hospitals have a different kind of silence, not peaceful, not strategic, fragile. Machines beeping softly, whispers in hallways, unspoken fear in every room. One evening he sat beside her hospital bed. She looked smaller than he remembered, weaker, but her eyes were clear. "You don't talk much," she said gently. He smiled faintly. "I talk when needed." She shook her head slowly. "No, you learned not to talk when it hurt." That sentence hit deeper than any insult ever had, because she was right. He didn't stay silent only because he was strong. He stayed silent because, as a child, speaking felt dangerous. He had mastered control, but he had never fully healed. And here is the truth most people miss about silence. If it comes from fear, it isolates you. If it comes from confidence, it elevates you. He realized something sitting there beside her. He wasn't afraid of other people's noise. He was afraid of becoming noise, afraid of turning into the kind of man who dominated through volume. So he overcorrected. He chose restraint over expression, control over vulnerability, silence over emotional risk. And that night something shifted inside him, because true security is not silence, it is choice, the ability to speak or not speak without fear controlling either decision. Months later, after his mother recovered, Armand faced another confrontation at work, but this time it felt different. A junior employee made a costly mistake. Everyone expected Armand to respond coldly, strategically, quietly. The old version of him would have simply fixed the issue without much discussion, but he saw fear in the employee's eyes, the same fear his brother had at the dinner table years ago, fear of being crushed by authority. And in that moment, Armand understood the final layer of silence. Insecure people panic when you're silent because they rely on noise to maintain control, but secure people use silence to create safety. So instead of staying silent, he spoke, calmly, not loudly, but clearly. "Mistakes happen, let's fix it together." The room relaxed instantly. The employee exhaled. There was no ego, no humiliation, no performance. And that was the twist. His power was never in silence itself. It was in emotional control. Silence was just one tool. And insecure people panic not because you're quiet, but because they cannot control your reaction. They cannot trigger you. They cannot shake you. They cannot predict you. When someone cannot control your reaction, they feel powerless, and insecurity hates powerlessness. That's why silence unsettles them. Because silence says, "I don't need to fight you to know who I am. I don't need your validation to stay steady. I don't need to dominate this space to own it." But the deepest realization came later. One evening, walking alone after work, he passed a group arguing loudly outside a cafe, voices raised, egos clashing, everyone trying to win, and he felt nothing, no urge to intervene, no discomfort, just clarity. He finally understood. Silence is not about making others uncomfortable. It is about being comfortable with yourself. When you're comfortable with yourself, other people's insecurity becomes visible, predictable, almost sad, because beneath every loud interruption, beneath every unnecessary criticism, beneath every attempt to provoke, there is fear.
Fear of not being enough, fear of being overlooked, fear of being insignificant, and silence forces insecure people to sit alone with that fear. That is why they panic, not because you're mysterious, but because you're not reacting, and when you don't react, they lose the illusion of control. But here is the final truth. Silence should not be your hiding place. It should be your weapon only when needed, your peace, your discipline, your filter. Speak when truth needs protection. Stay silent when ego demands reaction. Respond when growth is possible. Withdraw when drama seeks oxygen. Because real power is not loud, but it is not voiceless either. It is controlled. And when you master that control, insecure people will either attack you or respect you, but they will never ignore you. And the day you stop fearing their panic is the day you stop being controlled by their noise. Silence does not make you powerful, security does. Silence simply reveals who has it and who doesn't.